The first time Damiano Voss noticed her, she was turning down money. That alone was enough to make him stop. He had been moving through the rain, slicked streets of Naples at 11:30 on a Thursday night, his coat collar turned up against the cold, two bodyguards flanking him at the precise distance that communicated power without paranoia. He was not a man who noticed street corners. He was not a man who noticed much of anything that did not threaten him or profit him. After 34 years on this earth, the last 11 spent inside the machinery of the Voss syndicate, Damiano had cultivated a nearly perfect emotional blindness to the city he controlled. Naples was not beautiful to him anymore. It was a map of assets, a grid of leverage. But the girl stopped him. She was sitting on the steps of the old church on Via Tribunali, the one whose paint had been peeling since before either of them was born, its stone saints watching the street with expressions of patient exhaustion. She was perhaps 23 or 24, though the set of her jaw suggested someone who had lived more densely than her age. She wore a coat that had been good once. Wool, structured, the kind of coat that belongs to a woman who used to have somewhere important to be. But the lining showed at the hem and one button was replaced with a safety pin. Her dark hair was pulled back with a rubber band. In her lap was a cardboard box, slightly damp, and inside the box was the kind of thing that stopped even Damiano Voss. A child, an infant, barely old enough to lift its own head, swaddled in what appeared to be a man's flannel shirt. The child was sleeping despite the cold, one tiny fist pressed against its own cheek, utterly trusting in the way that only sleeping infants can be. With that complete, heartbreaking certainty that the world will hold still, the woman was not begging. She had no sign, no cup, no outstretched palm. She was simply sitting there in the rain with the baby in the box. Her eyes focused on the middle distance with an expression that Damiano recognized from his own mirror. The expression of someone calculating their remaining options. It was Enzo, his right-hand man, who made the mistake of reaching for his wallet. Enzo was not cruel. He was efficient and he was loyal, and occasionally, in moments like this one, he was sentimental. He had pulled out 2 folded 50s before the woman even looked up. "For the baby?" Enzo said, in the particular tone of men who want credit for generosity without the inconvenience of real connection. The woman looked at the money. Looked at the money again. "No," she said. Enzo blinked. "It's 100 euros? I can count." "Then take it. I don't want it." "Your child is sleeping in a box in the rain." "My child?" she said, with a precision that made the word feel like a blade being unsheathed, as warm and dry and fed, which she has been every day of her 9 weeks of life, despite circumstances that are not your business. "Keep your money." And Enzo looked at Damiano. Damiano said nothing. He was watching the woman. "At least let me call." "I'm not interested in what you want to call," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was the voice of someone who has nothing left to lose and has therefore also lost the ability to be intimidated. "I'm not a charity case. I'm thinking. If you need to do something useful, step out of the rain and let me think." Enzo stepped back, more out of surprise than obedience. He turned to Damiano with an expression that said, "Do you want me to handle this?" Damiano held up one finger. "Wait." He looked at the woman for a long moment. She had noticed him now. She would have noticed him when they first appeared. She had that kind of watchfulness. But she was looking at him the way she had looked at the money, with assessment rather than fear. Most people looked at Damiano Voss with some variation of fear. It was the thing his face did, the thing his posture did, the thing 11 years of building and defending and occasionally dismantling things did to a person. Fear was the typical response. She was not afraid. She was annoyed. "You're the third group tonight," she said, to Damiano specifically, as though she had already identified him as the one in charge. 2 men before offered money. A woman before them tried to hand me a pamphlet about a shelter. I don't need a shelter. I'm not lost. I'm sitting here because I'm trying to figure out a specific problem, and I need 30 more minutes to figure it out, and people keep interrupting me. Damiano crouched down, which surprised him. He was not a man who crouched. His knees were good and his suits were expensive, and neither were designed for street-level conversations. But something made him level himself with her until they were nearly eye to eye. "What's the problem?" he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the rain, dimmed light, and they were the eyes of someone who had been disappointed so many times that disappointment no longer registered as a separate emotion. It had simply become the baseline, the ground condition, the water they swam in. There was intelligence in them, and wariness, and something else. Something that looked almost like fury, carefully managed, the way you manage a fire in a small room. "Why?" she said slowly. "Ought I tell you? Because I might be able to solve it." "Everyone thinks they can solve things," she said. "Most of them make things worse." "That's true," Damiano said. Something in his agreement seemed to shift her slightly. She tilted her head. "My name is Damiano," he said. He did not say his last name. His last name was not something he offered to strangers in the rain. She said nothing for a moment. The baby stirred in the box, made a small sound, settled again. The woman reached in and adjusted the flannel shirt around the child's feet with a gesture so practiced and automatic that it clearly happened 50 times a day, without thought, without fanfare, just the perpetual reflex of motherhood. "Sophia," she finally said, not warm, not unfriendly, simply a name offered in equivalent exchange. "Sophia," he repeated. "Tell me the problem." She looked at him for a long time, with those calculating, fire-managing eyes deciding something. Then she said, "No." "But I'll ask you something instead." "All right." "I want nothing from you that can be bought. No money, no car, no apartment, no job you invented to make yourself feel better." She paused. "But if you are actually the kind of man who can solve things, and I mean solve things, not throw money at them, then I want 30 minutes of your attention. Your real attention. Not your assistant or your phone or your driver. Sitting here thinking about my problem, actually trying to help." Damiano stared at her. In 11 years, no one had ever asked him for his attention. His money, yes. His protection, his signature, his silence, his violence, when violence was called for. His connections, his influence, the architecture of fear he had spent a decade constructing. All of those things had been requested of him, purchased from him, demanded of him, negotiated around him. But never simply his attention. He sat down on the church steps beside her. Enzo made a sound. Damiano silenced it with a look. 30 minutes, Damiano said to Sophia. "Tell me." Her name was Sophia Marini. She was 24 years old, and she had been, until 14 weeks ago, a second-year medical student at the University of Naples, Federico who. The baby's name was Clara. Clara's father had been a fourth-year student named Matteo, who had, upon learning of the pregnancy, demonstrated a degree of personal character roughly equivalent to a man-shaped hole in the wall, through which he had subsequently disappeared. This was the part of the story Sophia delivered without particular bitterness, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting weather data. It had happened. It was not the problem. The problem was the apartment. She had been renting a room in a building on Via Caracciolo, not a nice building, but a legal one, with a contract and a functioning boiler, until the building's owner had sold it 6 weeks ago. The new owner had decided to convert the building into holiday rentals, which was not illegal and was not personal, but had the practical effect of leaving Sophia with 30 days' notice, a newborn, and no rental history sufficient to qualify for another lease in her own name. Since her income was currently zero and her guarantor had been her mother, who had died 3 years earlier of the kind of slow, expensive illness that depletes both finances and the network of people willing to sign forms on your behalf. She had been staying with a friend for the past 3 weeks. The friend's patience had, that afternoon, reached its structural limit. Not cruelly, just honestly. Sophia had packed her bag that evening, put Clara in the box that had once held a kitchen appliance and now served as the most functional portable bassinet Sophia had been able to engineer. She was not, she explained, without resources. She had a plan. The plan involved her father's older sister, a woman named Carmela, who lived in a flat on Via San Biagio di Librai and who had, 2 days ago, agreed by telephone to let Sophia stay for a month while she sorted out a new lease application. The problem was that Carmela's building had a door code that Carmela had texted to her, and Sophia's phone had died 40 minutes ago, and the code was on the phone, and she could not get into the building without the code, and Carmela was apparently a profoundly sound sleeper who was not answering her buzzer. "So I sat here to think," Sophia said. "Because there's a service that can retrieve messages from a dead phone, but it requires a SIM card reader and a laptop and a functioning internet connection, none of which I currently have. I've been trying to figure out if any of the open bars on this street have Wi-Fi and a charger I can borrow, and which one is least likely to throw me out for bringing a baby." She stopped. She looked at Damiano. Damiano looked at her. The entire situation, the full weight of it, the specific, practical, solvable nature of it, landed on him with an unexpected force. He had been expecting something larger, a debt, an illness, a disappeared person. The kind of problem that matched the expression on her face. That fire in a small room fury that suggested something epic was burning. But it was just a phone. It was just a door code. It was just a woman trying to get her baby inside a building on a cold night, thwarted by a battery. "That's it," he said. "That's enough," she said, with some heat. "I can solve that in 3 minutes." "I'm aware that you probably can," she said. "Which is why I asked for your attention instead of your money. I don't want you to throw resources at this and feel like you've done something. I want you to actually look at it. Because what I actually need beyond tonight, is to understand if there's a way to get a lease in this city without a guarantor and without a rental history. Because I've been looking at the regulations for 6 hours, and there's a clause in the Municipal Housing Act from 2019 that I think could work, but I can't tell if it's been implemented or if it's still theoretical. And I've been trying to figure out if I know anyone who knows anything about property law, and I don't." She stopped again. The baby made a small sound. Sophia reached in, adjusted the flannel, and looked at Damiano. "Your 30 minutes started about 7 minutes ago," she said. Damiano did not smile. He was not, under normal circumstances, a man who smiled. But something moved across his face. Something that Enzo, watching from 6 feet away in the rain, had not seen on his employer's face in a very long time. "Enzo?" Damiano said. "Boss, the phone charger? The number for Luca di Fazio, the property attorney. Yes, it's nearly midnight. Luca owes me 4 favors of decreasing legality." And Enzo moved. Damiano stayed on the steps, and he looked at Sophia Marini. And for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, Damiano Voss was not thinking about the map of assets or the grid of leverage. He was thinking about the 2019 Municipal Housing Act, and also slightly about her eyes. "You'll..." Luca di Fazio answered on the 3rd ring, sounding exactly like a man who was asleep and knew better than to pretend otherwise when Damiano Voss was calling. Within 12 minutes, Sophia had the name of a provision, the relevant subsection, and 3 steps she could take the following morning to initiate an application for what was called a socially guaranteed lease. A provision that had been implemented was functional and was specifically designed for individuals in situations of temporary financial instability who could demonstrate future earning capacity. Medical students qualified, even ones on academic leave, especially ones on academic leave. Within 3 more minutes, Enzo had produced a portable charger from the car. Sofia's phone had enough power to retrieve the door code, and Damiano had personally confirmed, by calling a contact who managed property registration in the 3rd municipality, that the building on Via San Biagio de Libri did indeed have a functioning buzzer system that required only the building's electrical box to be reset, which the same contact arranged via a call to the night maintenance contractor for the district. Carmela's buzzer worked on the first press. A window opened above. An elderly woman with wild grey hair and the expression of someone who had expected to be woken up eventually looked down at the street. When she saw Sofia, her face changed. To sorrow, she called down, and the word, "Treasured darling," my heart, carried across the wet street with the unstudied tenderness of old women who have survived enough to be honest about love. Come up, come up. I have the heater on. I have soup." Sofia stood. She picked up the box with Clara inside it, settled it against her chest in the practiced way, and turned to Damiano. He was standing now. The rain had eased to a fine mist. She was looking at him the same way she had looked at him from the steps. Assessing, calculating. But something had shifted in the calculus. The wariness was still there. The fire was still there. But underneath both of them was something that looked like surprise. "Thank you," she said, simply, without inflation or apology. "It was a solvable problem," he said. "Most problems are, if you actually look at them." "Wes," she nodded, and she turned toward the door. She stopped. He hadn't planned to say anything else. He was genuinely uncertain why he spoke. It was the kind of impulsive act that almost never happened to him. That he had, in fact, spent years engineering out of himself, because impulsive acts in his world had consequences that could not always be contained. But he heard himself say, "Tomorrow morning, when you go to the housing office, take this." He held out a card. Not a business card, he didn't carry those. It was just a card from his wallet with a phone number written on it in pen. "If they give you difficulty, call that number. The man who answers knows who I am. He'll make sure they process it." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "That's not attention," she said. "That's still money. Adjacent to money. It's a phone number, it's leverage. It's insurance," he said, "for a situation where what you need is correct, but the bureaucracy may not cooperate. Take it or don't." She took it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the baby, and she looked at the door, and she looked back at him one more time. She said, "Why what? Why are you still here? You solved the problem. Your 30 minutes are up. Why are you still on the street?" Damiano had no answer for this. He searched for one and found nothing. It was an uncomfortable absence, in the space where his usual certainty sat. "Go inside," he said, which was not an answer. Sofia Marini went inside. The door closed. The window above closed. From somewhere behind it, muffled and warm, Damiano could hear the sound of an old woman's voice, saying something with great urgency and affection, and the lower sound of Sofia's response. He stood on the wet street for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked back toward the car. "Boss," Enzo said, carefully, said Damiano. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Enzo said nothing. They drove. "Tell us your..." He did not think about her the following day. He was disciplined about that kind of thing. He had a meeting at 8 with the Port Authority liaison. a careful man who moved money through the inspection records with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it for 12 years and intended to do it for 12 more. He had a call at 10 with his counterpart in Palermo regarding a disagreement about distribution territory that had been simmering for 6 weeks and was beginning to steam. He had lunch at a restaurant he owned in the Chiaia district, during which his chef briefed him on 2 menu changes and his accountant briefed him on an irregularity in the Posillipo property accounts. He did not think about her. At 4 in the afternoon, his phone rang, a number he did not recognize. "It worked," said Sofia Marini's voice, without preamble or greeting. "The housing provision, they're processing it." The man at the counter looked up your name on the card and became extremely helpful. "The application should go through within 10 working days." "Good," Damiano said, a pause. "I'm returning the card," she said. "I don't want to keep it." "Why not?" "Because things that come with strings are worse than things that come with price tags," she said. "At least with a price tag you know what you're paying." "There are no strings. There are always strings with men like you." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of man do you think I am?" "I think you're the kind of man people cross the street to avoid. I think you're the kind of man whose favors come with interest rates that aren't disclosed up front. And I think," she paused, and when she continued her voice was slightly quieter, more careful, "I think you were genuinely kind last night. And I don't know what to do with that, because those 2 things don't usually belong to the same person." Damiano looked out the window of his office at the Bay of Naples, grey and restless under a February sky. "Keep the card," he said. "No strings, no interest. If you need it, use it. If you don't, throw it away in 10 years when you're a doctor and you have your own strings to give." A silence. "Sofia," he said, "how is Clara?" Another silence, longer. The kind of silence that happens when someone is surprised and is trying to decide whether to be moved by the thing that surprised them. Sofia said, "She's sleeping on Carmela's chest, and she looks very satisfied about it." "Good," Damiano said again. He hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he put it down and returned to his work. And if the call occupied a slightly larger portion of his mind than could be accounted for by its practical significance, he chose not to examine that too closely. The second time he saw her was not planned. He was at the hospital, the same hospital where 1 floor up and 2 wings over, medical students were presumably attending lectures on things Damiano had no frame of reference for the weekly visit he paid to Marco Ferrante. Marco was 58 years old, had worked for Damiano's father before he worked for Damiano, and had been managing supply logistics for the syndicate for nearly 2 decades before a stroke 14 months ago had reduced him to a man who sat in a room with a window and tried, every day, with the stubbornness of a person whose body has betrayed him, but whose will has not, to learn to hold a pen again. Damiano visited every week. This was not widely known. It was not performance and it was not penance. It was just a visit, the kind you pay to someone who gave you decades of loyalty and now sits alone in a hospital room with a window, trying to hold a pen. He was in the corridor on his way out when he heard a voice, low, clear, with the particular cadence of someone explaining something difficult in terms that don't condescend. And he turned, and there was Sofia Marini. She was not in the corridor as a patient. She was in a white coat that was slightly too large for her, with a stethoscope around her neck and a tablet in her hand, standing outside a room and speaking with an elderly man in a bed. The man was hard of hearing, and she had stepped close, repeating something about medication dosage with the specific patience of someone who has made peace with repetition. Damiano stopped. She had not seen him. She was entirely focused on the old man, who was nodding now, slower than the conversation required but with great earnestness, and Sophia smiled at something he said. A real smile, wide and unguarded, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who has temporarily stopped managing themselves. It transformed her face entirely, made her look young in the way that her age actually deserved, young and lit from somewhere inside, and Damiano felt something happen in his chest that he had no reliable vocabulary for. She went back, he realized. She went back to medical school. He had known she was on leave. He had not known she had returned. But the coat and the stethoscope and the tablet were not props. She had come back to the hospital, presumably with Clara managed and Carmela enlisted, and she had simply come back to the work. He should have kept walking. There was no reason to stop. There was no reason to make this into anything other than a coincidence in a corridor. Two people who had briefly shared a church step and a solvable problem. But she turned, the way people sometimes turn when they are being observed, some animal alertness firing before the conscious mind catches up. And she saw him. Her expression did several things in quick succession: surprise, recognition, worriness. Then something more complex that she pulled back under control before it could be read clearly. "You're in the hospital," she said, as if this required verification. "Weekly visit," he said. "Someone I know." "I'm on my first week back," she said, which was not quite a response to what he'd said, but answered the question he hadn't asked. "I can see that. Clara is with Carmela. I arranged it." "She's fine. I didn't ask. You were going to," she said. He was. She looked at the tablet in her hand, then at him. There was something in her expression that she was clearly working out. Some internal calculation. The same quality of deliberation she'd had on the church steps. He was beginning to recognize it as her particular way of making decisions, not impulsive, not slow, but thorough. She looked at things from all sides before she moved. "Coffee?" she said finally. "In the cafeteria. I have 15 minutes before rounds." "You're inviting me for coffee?" "I'm inviting myself for coffee. You can come if you want. I owe you nothing, and you owe me nothing, which means we can have a conversation without a transaction underneath it, which is rarer than it should be." Damiano looked at her. 15 minutes, he said. The cafeteria coffee was terrible. He drank it without complaint. She drank hers with the focused efficiency of someone operating on interrupted sleep, and she told him, in the 15 minutes they had, about the housing application's progress, about Carmela's growing attachment to Clara, about the arrangement she'd worked out with the university to be categorized as a student with dependent care responsibilities, which came with different scheduling allowances. She did not ask him about himself. She was not incurious. He could see that she was interested, that she noticed things. But she had made a decision not to ask, and he understood the decision without needing it explained. Asking would be entering territory, and she was not ready to enter territory. He respected this so completely that he almost didn't speak. But at the end of the 15 minutes, as she was standing and pulling her coat back on, he found himself saying, "Same time next week, if you want," where she paused. "You come here every week," she said. "Yes." "To visit someone?" "Yes." She looked at him with that appraising look, the fire management eyes. "Same cafeteria," she said. "I'll be here until 7. If our schedules align." She left. He sat with the bad coffee for another 3 minutes, alone in the bright fluorescent noise of a hospital cafeteria, feeling something that took him an embarrassingly long time to identify. It was anticipation. He had not felt anticipation. Real anticipation, the kind that has nothing to do with power or strategy. The kind that simply looks forward to something, in so long that he'd forgotten it had a texture. that it sat differently in the body than ambition or preparation or alertness, that it was lighter than those things and warmer and had the slightly vulnerable quality of wanting something you cannot control. He was not comfortable with it. He drove home, told Enzo nothing, and spent the evening working on a problem with the Port Authority records that required his full attention and received approximately 80% of it. The weeks that followed were. And Damiano recognized this as something he could not have predicted or engineered. The most interesting weeks he had experienced in years. They met in the cafeteria. Sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes 45, once nearly 2 hours when her afternoon schedule cleared unexpectedly, and his did not require him elsewhere. They drank terrible coffee and better tea, and Sophia talked about medicine, not performing enthusiasm but demonstrating it. The way people demonstrate things they actually love. And Damiano listened in a way he had not listened to another person for a very long time. She talked about diagnostic reasoning. She talked about the gap between what patients said and what their bodies were saying, and how the skill of medicine was learning to hear both conversations at once. She talked about her professor of internal medicine, a small, fierce woman who had told her in the first week of her leave of absence, "Go take care of your baby and come back. This hospital will not disappear, and neither will your brain." She talked about Clara, not obsessively, not performatively, but the way you talk about someone who is the organizing fact of your life, the fixed point around which everything else orbits. Clara had smiled. Clara had discovered her own hands. Clara had, apparently, strong opinions about being put down before she was ready. He did not tell her what he was. She knew, in the way that anyone with functional instincts would know, the rough shape of who he was and what his name meant in the city. She did not ask for specifics, and he did not offer them, and they existed in a space that was not deception exactly. More like a deliberate courtesy, an agreement to let the map of his life stay folded for now. What he did tell her was other things. Small things. The sediment that accumulates under a life when you have spent years refusing to examine it. He told her about Marco Ferrante. Not who Marco was in the syndicate, but who Marco was to him, which was the first man who had ever treated the young Damiano Voss as though his mind was worth something, who had sat with him at 18 and said, "You're smarter than this, you know that." He told her about Naples, not as a map of assets, but as a city he had once loved purely, before he owned pieces of it. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and about the specific way grief worked when you were 12. How it went underground rather than through. She listened the way. She apparently did everything with her full attention, which was not a soft thing. Her attention had weight and direction. It landed on you. One evening in the 4th week, as they were leaving, him to his car, her to the bus, because she had not yet sorted a car and declined the ride he offered with the same specificity she had declined the €100. She stopped at the cafeteria door and turned to him.
"Yes."
"You know that I know what you are, a beat." "I know," he said. "And I know that you know that I know." "Wes, I just want to say it once, out loud. So it's not a thing between us that we're pretending isn't there." He looked at her carefully. "And once you've said it, then we can decide what we're doing. Because right now I'm not sure what we're doing, and I've never been good at not knowing what I'm doing." He was quiet for a moment. The hospital corridor was busy around them, nurses, visitors, the perpetual urgent choreography of a place where people were always either arriving or leaving something consequential. "I don't know what we're doing either," he said, which was honest. "That doesn't happen to me often." She studied his face. "Good," she said, surprisingly. I think that's good." Then she left. He met Clara at the 6-week mark. It was accidental. He arrived early and Sofia was still wrapping up a call with Carmela, managing a logistics issue about a feeding schedule, and she waved him to sit and continued the call. "Yeah." And Damiano sat across from her at the cafeteria table and found himself approximately 12 inches from a baby who was regarding him from her mother's lap with the particular unimpressed focus of very small children. Clara was 9 weeks old now, and she had Sofia's dark eyes and, apparently, Sofia's evaluative disposition. She looked at Damiano with the direct, unself-conscious study of someone who has not yet learned that staring is rude. And he looked back at her, and neither of them moved for approximately 30 seconds. Then Clara reached out one small hand, not reaching for him. Exactly. More reaching for the general direction of his face, the way infants reach for interesting things without plan. And Damiano, without thinking, extended one finger. Clara grabbed it. Her grip was startling. Small fingers, unbelievable grip. She pulled it toward her, appeared to consider it, and put it in her mouth. Sofia, finishing her call, looked down. "She does that to everything," she said, with faint apology. "She's thorough," Damiano said. Sofia looked at him. This man whose name ran through the city's undercurrents like a river that carved its own banks. This man who was sitting in a hospital cafeteria with a baby's grip on his finger and the expression of someone confronting a completely new category of experience. Something shifted in her. He could see it. A small tectonic shift, barely visible, the kind that changes the landscape over time, took Clara back. Clara expressed displeasure about the withdrawal of the finger with a sound like a small, furious bird. Damiano looked at his finger, which had small, toothless indentations in it, and he almost smiled. "She likes you?" Sofia said. "She liked my finger." "Same thing at this stage." He looked up. Sofia was watching him with the evaluative look. But something had changed in the evaluation. The calculation was coming out differently now. He could see her revising something. "I should tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I've been keeping you at a specific distance because I thought it was the right thing to do. Given who you are, given what you do." She paused. "I still think it's probably the right thing." "But," he said. "But you held my daughter's hand," she said, "and you looked at her like she was a real person, not an inconvenience or a prop or a small animal. And there aren't that many people who do that." She was quiet for a moment. "That matters to me, more than the distance I was keeping." The silence between them was different from the usual silences. It had changed color. "Sofia," he said, "there are things about my life that would make what you just said." "I know," she said. "You don't know specifically." "I know enough. What I'm trying to say is that I don't want you to recalibrate something based on a moment in a cafeteria, and then, I'm a medical student," she said with quiet precision. "I've sat with people who are dying and people who might not die and people who are waiting to find out which one. I don't recalibrate casually. When I change my position on something, it's because the evidence has changed." She looked at him. The evidence changed. Damiano looked at her for a long moment. Clara, between them, was contemplating her own knuckle. "I want to see you outside the hospital," he said. "I know." "Without a timeline?" "Without a timeline," she agreed. "Though I should tell you now, Clara comes. I know that. And I won't pretend your world doesn't exist. I wouldn't ask you to." She nodded. "Then okay." "Okay," he said. What followed was not a courtship in any form that Damiano had a template for. He had had women in his life before, relationships built on the particular currency of power and attraction, which burned bright and left clean ash. He knew how those worked. He knew the architecture of wanting and being wanted when both parties understood the terms implicitly, He was powerful. He was available. He was controlled, and he would maintain a careful distance from genuine vulnerability, because genuine vulnerability was a structural weakness, and structural weaknesses got people killed or leveraged against. This was not that. Sofia came to dinner at the restaurant he co-owned in Chiaia, and she ate the food with the direct pleasure of someone who had been surviving on hospital cafeteria meals and Carmela's soup. And she asked questions about the wine that were real questions, not performance. And she told the chef that the branzino was exceptional, and she meant it. She brought Clara in a carrier strapped against her chest, and Clara slept through the entire meal with the serene indifference of a person who has no strong opinions about restaurants. He went once to the apartment she had moved into, her own lease, processed under the 2019 provision, a second-floor flat in the Quartiere Spagnoli district with high ceilings and noisy neighbors, and a kitchen that she had reorganized with systematic efficiency. It was not a large apartment. It was not decorated to impress. It had Clara's things everywhere, the occupied density of a small person who takes up enormous space. And it had Sofia's books, which covered one entire wall and had the particular arrangement of someone who actually reads rather than displays. He stood in front of them while she made coffee and looked at the titles, and they told him more about her interior life than any direct conversation had. Medicine, history of medicine, novels, mostly Italian, some in English, a few in French, one shelf of poetry, a section of books he recognized as belonging to someone else, someone male, based on the spines, with interests in economics and football. And he did not ask about this shelf, and she did not explain it. But he understood it was the residue of Matteo, and that it had not been removed, because she had not yet had the time or energy to make that particular decision. He did not say anything about the shelf. He sat at her kitchen table and drank her coffee and played a rudimentary game with Clara that consisted entirely of making faces and waiting to see how long it took her to replicate them. And Sofia stood in the doorway watching them with an expression he did not see because he was not looking at her. But she was looking at him. She was looking at him and thinking about the fact that this was the man who had sat down on the church steps, who had asked what the problem was, who had called a property attorney at midnight, and then sat in the rain and actually thought about subsection clauses in municipal housing law, with the focused intelligence of someone for whom problems exist to be solved regardless of their size. She was thinking about the fact that Clara, who had the evaluative disposition of her mother and was not easily impressed, reached for him. She was thinking about the fact that she was, despite every reasonable calculation, falling in love with a man who ran one of the 3 most powerful criminal organizations in the south of Italy. She was thinking about the fact that she was not, on reflection, able to bring herself to stop. The first time she saw the other side of him was 2 months into what they were calling, carefully, a relationship, with the understanding that the word meant something different for both of them, and they were still mapping the territory. She was waiting for him outside a restaurant on Via Partenope when a car pulled up. Not his car, a different one, and 2 men got out. She understood immediately that something was wrong, not from anything dramatic, but from the particular quality of their attention. They were scanning the street the way people scan streets when they expect a problem. One of them saw her before she could move, and he said something to the other, and they walked toward her. She stood still. She had made a decision, at some early point in knowing Damiano, that she would not perform fear. She felt it. She was not stupid, and her instincts were good. But performing it gave other people something to work with, and she had learned this a long time ago. "You're the doctor," said the taller one. Student, she said. Same thing. He looked at her carefully. You should know that some people think you're a vulnerability. I'm not a vulnerability, she said. I'm a person. Those aren't mutually exclusive. What do you want? Just to know that you understand the situation, he said. That you're aware of what it means to be in Voss's orbit. That you have options. He handed her a card. If you decide you'd prefer a different kind of life. Quieter. She looked at the card, looked at him. Then she put the card in her coat pocket and said, Thank you for the information. In the same tone she used with patients who had decided their symptoms were something they'd found on the internet. Then she turned away from them. She heard them get back in the car. She heard the car leave. Her hands were trembling slightly. She took 3 breaths, counted them, stopped trembling. When Damiano arrived 4 minutes later, she was standing exactly where he expected her to be. He saw something in her face. What happened? She told him. Simply, without escalation. She described the 2 men, what they looked like, what they had said, the card they had given her. He was very still while she spoke. The stillness he had when something was happening inside him that he was keeping contained. She had learned to recognize it, the almost architectural quality of his control. Give me the card, he said. She did. He looked at it. A small muscle moved in his jaw. This is Foster Ricker, he said. I don't know who that is. He's been pushing on our territory for 8 months. A pause. He found out about you? I see, she said. Sophia, I'm not going to do the obvious thing, she said. I'm not going to panic or demand you fix it or pretend this isn't part of the situation. Because it is, I knew that. I know that. She paused. But I also have Clara. And Clara is. She stopped. Started again. Clara is not a vulnerability. She is not leverage. She is a 9-month-old person who has nothing to do with any of this, and I need you to understand that there is an absolute line there. Whatever happens between us, whatever happens in your world, she doesn't touch it. She will never touch it, he said. And something in his voice had changed. A quality that went below his usual controlled register, something deeper and more fundamental. I need you to hear me when I say that. Not as a reassurance. As a fact. As the most certain thing I've said in years. She looked at him. I believe you, she said. But, he said, because he could hear it. But I need to ask you something. Ask. The life you live. The things you do. I'm not naive about them. I have decided deliberately not to ask for specifics. Because the specifics aren't what I need, and they're not what changes my decision. But I need to ask you. Not about what you've done, but about what you want. Because I think. She paused, and for the first time he saw something in her face that was not the managed fire, not the assessment, but something rawer and more vulnerable. I think there's a person in you who made different choices at 18 than he would make now. And I need to know if I'm right about that. Because if I'm wrong, then this ends here, and I'll figure something out. But if I'm right? She stopped. If you're right, he said quietly. If I'm right, she said. Then we have a harder conversation. And a harder choice. But we have it honestly. He stood on the street in the cold air from the bay, and he felt himself at the edge of something. He had been at edges before. Physical ones, dangerous ones, the kind where the wrong step meant consequences that could not be undone. He knew the particular vertigo of edges. This one was different. This edge was not dangerous in the way he was trained to understand danger. It was dangerous in the way that complete honesty is always dangerous, because once you say certain things, you cannot know them. I'm right, he said. Silence. I'm right, she said. Yes. She closed her eyes for a moment. He saw her take the information in, sort it, file it somewhere that would require returning to. Then she opened her eyes. Okay, she said. Then we have the harder conversation. Not tonight, he said. "Not on the street." "No," she agreed. "Not tonight." "Come inside," he said. "I'll explain Fausto Rica and what I'm going to do about it, because you have the right to know that. And then we'll talk about the other thing. When you're ready?" "When we're both ready," she said. "Yes." They went inside. "Tell us your—" Fausto Rica was a man who had come up through the Camorra's eastern networks and had, over the past 4 years, been methodically expanding into territory that was not his. He was clever, patient, and had the particular kind of ambition that does not show itself until it is already entrenched. He had been watching Damiano's operation for 2 years before he made his first actual move, which was the distribution territory dispute that had been simmering since winter. The approach to Sofia had been a test. Rica's preferred method of assessment was to find pressure points and apply careful pressure, not to do damage yet, but to map the territory of someone's attachments. Damiano had known about Rica for longer than Rica knew. He had, in fact, been preparing a response that was careful, deliberate, and would not require the most straightforward option, which was violence. He explained this to Sofia in her kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, while Clara slept in the next room. He explained it plainly, without the verbal architecture he used in business to obscure what was actually happening. He told her about the territory dispute, about the port records, about the legal pressure he had been quietly building through Di Fazio and 2 other attorneys. Building a case that would give him a way to neutralize Rica's expansion, not through force, but through a careful, entirely procedural series of filings that would freeze Rica's assets and remove his ability to operate for long enough that his own network would dissolve around him. "You're solving it legally," Sofia said. "I'm solving it with leverage," he said, "which is not entirely legal and not entirely illegal. But not violently. Not if this works. And if it doesn't." He looked at her steadily. "That's not an answer." "If it doesn't," he said, "then I have to make a different calculation. And that calculation will involve choices I would prefer not to make." "But you might make them." He was quiet. "Damiano," she said, not accusing, just pressing, "I need you to be honest." "I might make them," he said. "If the alternative was a threat to you or to Clara, I would not pretend otherwise." "That honesty is what you asked for." She sat with this for a moment. He watched her face. "All right," she said finally. "All right. I asked for honesty. You gave it." She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend that's a comfortable thing to hear. But it's the truth, and truth is what we're doing." He nodded. "But I want something," she said. "Not about the immediate situation. Long term." She was looking at him steadily. The way she looked at patients when she was telling them something that was going to change how they understood their situation. "I want to understand what your actual plan is. For your life, for the organization. Whether there's an exit you've thought about." He was silent for a long time. "I've thought about it," he said finally. And it's complicated in ways that I don't want to oversimplify by saying, yes, there's a plan or no, there isn't. Then give me the complicated version." So he gave her the complicated version. He talked about it the way he had never talked about it. With another person, out loud, in the full acoustic reality of a kitchen that had children's things on the counter and a woman looking at him, who was not going to let him get away with approximations. He talked about the syndicate structure, about the people in it, who depended on it not simply for income, but for their sense of order, their sense of belonging, their sense of place in the world. He talked about what extraction looked like for a man in his position, how it was not leaving a job, but dismantling a system that would leave damage in its wake if done wrongly or quickly. He talked about what he had been building, quietly, For 2 years, legal businesses that were real, not facades. The restaurant, 2 import companies, a property management firm, the slow, deliberate architecture of a parallel economy built with patience. "You're building a way out," she said. "I'm building something that could be a way out," he said carefully. "I'm not there yet. I'm not going to tell you I'm 2 years away when I don't know that." "How long?" 4 years. Maybe 5. If nothing disrupts the plan. She was quiet. "That's a long time," she said.
Yes.
"Clara will be in school, Liz." She looked at her hands. He watched her face and saw her working through something difficult. Something with many dimensions, something she was not going to resolve in a single kitchen conversation at midnight. "I'm not asking you to wait," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything you haven't decided to give." "I know that," she said. "Then what are you thinking?" She looked up. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that I love you." The words landed in the kitchen with the weight of things that have been true for a while and are only now being spoken. He stared at her. "And I'm thinking," she continued, "that I have a daughter and a career and a specific set of values that I'm not willing to compromise, and that the situation you just described is real and honest and complicated, and I need to sit with all of that before I decide what it means for what comes next." She paused. "But I wanted you to know the first thing first, because you gave me honesty and it deserved honesty back." "Sophia?" "You don't have to say it back right now," she said. "This isn't a transaction." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was the expression of someone who has been holding something carefully for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. "I love you," he said, not performing it, not managing it, just saying it in the same way she had, with the weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being spoken. She looked at him. Something in her face became very still and then very open, the way a window looks when it's opened in a room that's been closed for a long time. "Okay," she said. "Then we figure out the rest." The rest, as it turned out, did not proceed according to any plan either of them had made. Fausto Rica moved first. Damiano had estimated him as a patient man. He had underestimated the extent to which that patience had a pressure threshold, a point at which it gave way to action. The asset freezing maneuver was further along than Rica should have been able to detect. It had been built carefully, the legal architecture obscured inside a mesh of holding companies and filing jurisdictions. But Rica had an attorney of his own who was better than anticipated, and the attorney had found the thread. The morning after Damiano had sat in Sophia's kitchen and said the word love for the first time in 11 years, he woke to Enzo at his door at 5 a.m. with the expression of someone delivering news they would rather not deliver. Rica moved. Enzo said, "Last night, he went for the port accounts. He filed with the Revenue Authority. He's got documentation. I don't know how. How long before the freeze goes through?" Di Fazio says 48 hours. "Cal Di Fazio, call him now. Get to the district filing office before it opens. I want the counter, filing ready to go the minute the doors open." He was moving while he spoke, the way he always moved in a crisis, with the controlled speed of someone for whom emergency had become a native state. "Who else knows? Rinaldi? That's it. Get Rinaldi. Tell him we anticipated this." He stopped, looked at Enzo. "We did anticipate this. We anticipated the possibility," Enzo said carefully. "We planned for it. We planned for the most likely version. This version is slightly different." "How different?" Enzo hesitated. "He also filed something personal. On you? Financial." The quality of the air in the room changed. "How old?" Damiano said. 12 years. 12 years was the beginning. 12 years was the year his father died, and left the syndicate to a 22-year-old who had 3 months to prove he could hold it or watch it disassemble around him. 12 years was the year Damiano Voss had made choices he had never fully examined, because examining them was not compatible with continuing to function. Damiano said, "Here's someone inside." Enzo said, "Has to. That level of documentation doesn't come from public records. Find the someone inside." "I'm already." "Find them today. Not tomorrow." Today Enzo left. Damiano stood in his bedroom and felt the architecture of the past 11 years trembling around him like a building in a wind it was not designed for. He had known this moment would come eventually. You did not build what he had built without creating the possibility of its unraveling. But the timing was what his entire plan had been designed to prevent. He was not ready. The parallel economy was not ready. The exit was not ready. And now there was Sofia. Now there was Clara. Now there were people whose safety was entangled with his exposure in a way he had spent years avoiding. He sat on the edge of his bed, and he did something he had not done since he was 12 years old. He bent his head into his hands, not from weakness, not from despair, but from the specific weight of consequences. The weight of the thing you see clearly when you stop moving long enough to look. He had been moving for 11 years. He had been strategic and controlled and relentlessly forward-facing, and he had convinced himself that this was strength, and sometimes it was. But sometimes it was also just running from the place where you stopped and looked. He stopped. He looked. What he saw was a 12-year accumulation of choices that had protected him and built him, and also, piece by piece, enclosed him, the way a man can build a house so strong that eventually it becomes a fortress, and eventually it becomes a prison. He had met a woman who refused his money on a church step in the rain. She had asked for his attention instead, and he had given it, and it had cracked something open in him that 11 years of careful construction had not been able to prevent. He had 3 options. He could fight Rico on legal ground, with the 48 hours he had, and everything Di Fazio could mobilize. He could fight him on other ground, which was faster and would work and would set back the exit plan by a minimum of 2 years, because it would require resources and exposure and consequences that compounded. Or he could do the thing he had been building toward, but had told himself was 4 or 5 years away. He could accelerate the extraction, take the damage it would cause, and come out the other side of it faster than he'd planned, but diminished in ways that could not be controlled. He raised his head. He called Di Fazio. Then he called someone else. Not Enzo, not Rinaldi. A man named Carlo Messa, who had been for 6 years Damiano's connection to the judiciary. Not a corrupt connection, which people sometimes assumed, but a careful one. A man who knew what Damiano knew and was willing to offer information in exchange for certain considerations that were legal, if not entirely comfortable. He said when the phone was answered, "I need a meeting. Today?" "This is early," Carlo said. "I know. It's important." "How important?" "I'm considering doing something I've been thinking about for 2 years. A long pause on the line. Something that requires me specifically. Something that requires your specific knowledge of the process," Damiano said, "and your discretion, and possibly your courage." "To another pause? Tonight?" Carlo said. 7, the bookshop. "Tonight," Damiano said. He hung up. He sat for one more moment in the bedroom. Then he stood and went to his wardrobe and dressed with the particular care of a man preparing for something significant, and he called Sofia. She answered on the 2nd ring. She sounded awake. She was always awake early. Clara's schedule was his schedule's opposite, and there was something in his voice that she heard immediately. "What happened?" she said. "Something I need to handle today. I wanted you to know. Not the details. There isn't time right now. But I wanted you to know two things. Tell me. First, you and Clara are safe. I've already called Enzo and he's sending someone to be near your building. Not intrusive. Just near? Damiano? Second, he paused. What I said last night. I want you to know it informed what I'm doing today. Directly. It changed the calculation. A silence. He could hear her breathing. Are you safe? She said. I'll be careful. That's not what I asked. I'll be careful, he repeated. And I'm making choices today that point toward a different kind of future. That's all I can tell you right now. She was quiet for a long moment. Come home tonight, she said. Wherever tonight ends. Come and tell me. I will, he said. The meeting with Carlo Messer in the back of the bookshop on Via Toledo lasted 3 hours and produced something Damiano had not fully allowed himself to want before. The shape of an actual exit. Not a clean one. There was no clean exit from what he had built. But there was an honest one. A transaction between a man who had spent 11 years inside an architecture of power and a system that was willing to give certain considerations in exchange for certain information. Carlo had been building this pathway for years, not only for Damiano, but as a matter of professional investment. A prosecutor's instinct to understand which cases, if handled correctly, could do more structural good than a straightforward conviction. What Damiano had was documentation. 11 years of documentation, not incriminating to himself beyond certain recoverable charges, but damning to people above and beside him in the network. People whose activities made his own look carefully managed, which was the truth. People who had used the legitimacy Damiano's operations provided as cover for things he had not endorsed, and in some cases had not known about until he knew, and had chosen not to act on, which was its own charge. He was honest about this in the 3-hour meeting. He said the things he had never said, not performing contrition. He was constitutionally unable to perform. But giving the factual account of a man who had maintained a careful ledger of his own actions and was now opening it. Carlo listened with the focused quiet of a man receiving information he has been waiting for. The timeline, Carlo said. Damiano said. 12 is safer. I need 6. The Ricca situation. Ricca is a separate problem. I'm handling Ricca through DeFazio. This is about after Ricca. What you're offering, Carlo said carefully, is enough to change the conversation. But you understand what it means? It means dismantling the operation while appearing not to. It means your network will not know until it's too late for them to stop it. The network will be fine, Damiano said. The legal businesses will continue. The people who have been with me for years, the ones who haven't crossed certain lines, I've been building their protection into the structure for 2 years. They have options, and the others. The others will face whatever they face, Damiano said. I'm not able to protect everyone, and I stopped trying to make that my problem at some point in the past 2 years. Carlo looked at him. What changed 2 years ago? Damiano thought of a woman sitting on a church step. A woman who refused money. A woman who asked for attention instead, and then used the attention to solve a housing problem, and somehow, in the solving of it, cracked something open in him that had been sealed for 11 years. I started thinking about what comes after, he said. The arrangement was made. Not simple, not clean, but real. Carlo would work through his channels. Damiano would work through DeFazio and the parallel economy he'd been building. Ricca would be handled legally. The counter filing would freeze the freeze, buying time. And then, over 6 to 12 months, with the careful, deliberate dismantling of a man who has decided to take apart his own architecture rather than wait for someone else to knock it down, Damiano Voss would stop being what he had been. He didn't know exactly what he would be instead, but he had a kitchen in the Quartiere Spagnoli in mind, and a baby who grabbed fingers, and a woman who had against every reasonable calculation, looked at the evidence and changed her assessment. You? He was at Sophia's door at 10:15 that night. She opened it before he could knock. She had been listening, he realized, the way a person listens when they are waiting for a sound they are not sure will come. She looked at his face. She was a medical student. She was trained to read faces for information they were not trying to give. She read his. "Come in," she said. Clara was asleep. The apartment was quiet in the particular way of a small place that contains a sleeping baby. Not silent, but deliberately still, sounds moving around the central fact of the sleeping child with practiced care. He sat at her kitchen table. She made tea, and she sat across from him, and he told her. Not everything, not the specific language of the arrangement with Carlo, which was not hers to carry, but enough. He told her about the meeting, about the decision, about the shape of what the next year would look like. She listened without interrupting. He appreciated this about her. The discipline of her attention, the way she received information before she responded to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you safe while this is happening?" she said. "Ricker is the immediate threat, and I'm managing it. After Ricker is handled, the transition period has risks, but they're manageable." Manageable or managed? Both. She nodded. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything. I'm just telling you where things are." "That's not what I mean," she said. "I mean in the actual sense, practically. What is the hardest part of the next year, and what would make it easier?" He stared at her. "You're doing something enormous and difficult and real," she said, with the directness that he had come to understand as her fundamental mode of being in the world. "You're doing it because it's right, and because it changes what your life looks like, and because of—" She paused. "Because of us. And I'm not going to sit here and be a thing you did it for without being a person who helps. That's not how I operate. Tell me what you need." He was quiet for a long time. What he needed, he realized, what the specific, solvable problem was not anything logistical or practical. What he needed was the thing she had given him every week in a hospital cafeteria, and every evening in her kitchen, and every conversation where she had looked at him with the full weight of her attention and found him, despite everything worth looking at. "This," he said finally. "Just this. Sitting in my kitchen? Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him first. He realized this. In months of carefully measured proximity, she had been the one setting the pace, and he had respected it. And this was the first time she had been the one to close the distance. Her hand was warm and steady. The hand of someone who had learned to keep her hands steady, because steady hands matter when you're working on people. "Then you have it," she said. They sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen, with Clara sleeping in the next room and the sounds of the Quartieri Spagnoli moving outside the window, the ordinary noise of a city going about its life. And Damiano felt something he had not felt since before his mother died, before everything became strategy and structure and control. He felt held. The Ricker situation resolved 17 days later, not with violence but with the kind of procedural precision that satisfied Damiano on a level that surprised him. Di Fazio's counter-filing had worked, not perfectly. There had been a tense 48 hours during which it was genuinely unclear which way the revenue authority would move. But the documentation they had assembled, the careful layering of the counter-evidence, had been sufficiently persuasive. Ricker's assets were frozen first. His attorney was found to have a conflict of interest that invalidated the original filing, and two separate businesses that Ricker had been using as laundering operations were referred to a financial crimes unit that had been investigating them independently for 8 months and had simply needed one more clean piece of evidence. Enzo told him the news at 7 in the morning. Damiano was at his desk. He read the documents DeFazio had sent. He signed what needed signing. Then he sat back in his chair and thought about the fact that he had just defended his position without deploying the part of his power that had always, until now, been the final option. He had fought it with paperwork and attorneys and a careful reading of municipal financial law. It felt, unexpectedly, like winning something other than the immediate battle. He went to the hospital that afternoon. He visited Marco, who was writing sentences now, short ones, imperfect, but his own, and who looked at Damiano when he walked in with the expression of someone who is seeing something different without being able to name it. "You look like something lifted," Marco said, slowly, the way he said things now, each word a small act of will. "Something did," Damiano said. Marco nodded with the economy of a man for whom words had become precious. He said. Then Damiano went to the cafeteria, and Sofia was already there, in the white coat, eating a sandwich with the focused efficiency of her 15-minute break. And she looked up when he walked in and something happened in her face. Something that went warm and open before she could manage it. And she smiled at him. The wide, unguarded one. He sat down across from her. "It worked," he said. "I heard," she said. "DeFazio called Carmela for some reason." "Carmela told me. I don't know how those two know each other." "Carmela knows everyone," Damiano said, with the faint tone of someone who had come to understand this as a law of the universe. "She does." Sofia put down the sandwich. "Right. Yes. Really." "Really," he paused. "I'd like to take you somewhere, tomorrow night. If Carmela can have Clara." She tilted her head. "Where? The restaurant?" "I want to take you somewhere that's mine, something I'm genuinely proud of. And I want to do it properly. Not cafeteria coffee." She looked at him for a moment. She repeated, "Properly," he said. "That word means something?" "The way you're saying it, yes," he said. "It does." The look on her face was the look she always had when she was deciding something. That deliberate, thorough assessment. But under it, clearly visible, was the thing she could not always manage away: the warmth. The wanting. The thing that happened in her when she looked at him that she had stopped pretending wasn't there. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Tell us your..." The restaurant was closed for other guests that evening. Damiano had not announced this to Sofia. He had simply arranged it, the way he arranged things, and she arrived to find the space lit by candlelight, with a table set by the window that overlooked the bay, and the chef present specifically to cook for 2 people, and no other noise. She stood in the entrance and looked at the room and looked at him. "This is properly," she said. "This is properly," he confirmed. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before. Blue, simply cut, belonging to a woman who had somewhere important to be. She had fixed her hair differently than the rubber band allowed, which he noticed and would not have been able to explain why he noticed. She was carrying a small bag, and she looked, standing in the candlelit entrance of his restaurant, like the most real person he had ever seen. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was entirely, specifically herself, no performance, no presentation. Just Sofia in a blue dress with her doctor's hands and her fire, management eyes and the particular quality of presence that had stopped him on a street corner in the rain. He had something in his pocket. He had been thinking about it for 3 weeks. He had not told Enzo. He had not told anyone. He had thought about it alone, carefully from all sides, the way he thought about things that mattered, and when he had reached the end of the deliberation, the answer was so clear that it felt less like a decision than a recognition. They ate. The chef had made something extraordinary: local fish, late seasoned vegetables, a dessert that Sophia demolished with the lack of inhibition she brought to food she genuinely enjoyed. They talked about Carlo's timeline, about Clara's new developmental milestone, which involved pulling herself upright against furniture and looking profoundly surprised by her own achievement, about Sophia's upcoming clinical rotation, about Marco's sentences. After the dessert, when the chef had retreated to the kitchen and the restaurant was fully silent, except for the sound of the bay through the glass, Damiano reached into his pocket. He put the ring on the table between them. It was not a large ring. He had specifically not bought a large ring because a large ring was the kind of thing that was about performance, and he was done with performance. It was a simple thing. A gold band with a single stone, round cut, the color of the deep water at the edge of the bay. And he had chosen it because when he saw it, he thought of her eyes. He had no more sophisticated justification than that. Sophia looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Damiano," she said. "I know," he said, "that the timing is wrong by conventional measurement. I know that I'm still inside a transition that's going to take a year, maybe more. I know that what I'm asking you to take on is not a simple thing." He paused. "But I also know that I sat on a church step because a woman refused money that I didn't offer and solved a problem in 30 minutes, and then refused to give me credit for the solution, and then turned out to be. He stopped. He was not a man who struggled for words. He was struggling for words. "Everything," Sophia said softly. "I was going to say that," he said. "I was going to say the exact word you just said." She looked at the ring and at him, and at the bay through the glass, and her eyes were doing the thing they did. The assessment, the calculation, the thorough deliberation. But under all of it, clearly, was the warmth. The warmth he had watched grow in her since the first night. The warmth she had tried to manage and had eventually, simply, stopped trying to manage because it was larger than the management system she designed for it. "I told you in my kitchen," she said, "that I love you, Wes. And I told you that I have a daughter and values, and a career that I'm not compromising. Yes. And you said yes to all of that, completely," he said, "and you're building a way out." "I'm building a life," he said. "The exit from the old one and the entrance to the new one are the same act." She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright in the candlelight. Not yet, but the quality of brightness that precedes them. "Clara needs a father," she said. "A real one, not a title, not a presence, the actual work of it." "I know. Do you? Do you actually know what that means? Because it means school plays and fevers and bad days and years when she hates everyone including you, and teaching her to drive and watching her make mistakes and loving her through all of it. The entire long, specific, difficult, beautiful length of it." "Yes," he said. "That's what I want." "Why?" she said. Not challenge, genuine inquiry. The medical student's question. The diagnostic question. He thought about it honestly. He thought about sitting on a church step and being asked for his attention. He thought about a baby grabbing his finger with a grip that should have been impossible and entirely was not. He thought about Marco writing sentences. He thought about what it felt like to sit in a kitchen at 11 at night with terrible tea and a woman who looked at you and actually saw you. The whole thing, the parts you were proud of and the parts you were not, and decided you were worth staying. "Because when I sat down on those steps," he said, "something cracked. Something that I had been keeping sealed for 11 years, and everything that came after was just following the crack, seeing where it led. Sophia reached across the table. She picked up the ring. She turned it over in her fingers once, looking at it. The stone caught the candlelight. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He was very still. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said, and she put the ring on her own finger because she was Sophia Marini and she did things herself. She had always done things herself, and this was not different. Then she looked up at him with the real smile, the wide, unguarded, untranslatable smile, and she said, "And I'm going to need you to understand that this is the last time you do something this significant without consulting me first. We make decisions together from now on." "Together?" he said. "Together." The year that followed was not simple. No year is simple when a man is carefully dismantling an architecture of power while simultaneously building something else in its place. And no year is simple when a woman is completing her medical training with a toddler at home and a fiancé whose name still carries a particular weight in the city. There were hard weeks. There were nights when the complexity, what they had taken on, sat heavily in the kitchen. Where they had their hardest conversations, always in the kitchen, it had become the room where they kept their truest selves. There was a night in early autumn when something went wrong with the transition. A piece of documentation that had been thought secure turned out not to be, and Damiano came home at 2 in the morning with the particular expression he wore when he was managing something close to the edge, and Sophia sat with him and did not ask him to explain everything and did not pretend it was fine, but put her hands around his and sat with him in the particular way that she had understood from very early was the specific thing he needed. Not solutions, not reassurance. Presence. There was a morning in the spring when Clara, 18 months old and entirely certain of herself, toddled across the kitchen to where Damiano was sitting and put both arms up. The universal gesture. The one that means lift me. I want to be where you are. He lifted her. She settled against his chest with the concentrated satisfaction of a person who has arrived exactly where she intended, and she grabbed the collar of his shirt in both small fists and looked up at his face with her mother's appraising dark eyes. Sophia, at the counter, was pretending to be very interested in her coffee. "She does that to everyone," Damiano said, with the careful composure of a man who is feeling something enormous and is not sure he has the vocabulary for it. "No," Sophia said, not looking up from her coffee, because she knew if she looked up she would cry, and she was not ready to cry that morning. "She doesn't." There was a conversation late in the autumn when Clara, who had acquired language with the same efficient thoroughness she brought to everything, pointed at Damiano and said, for the first time, with the undeniable clarity of a child who has decided something and is announcing it as established fact. The kitchen was very quiet. Damiano turned from the stove where he was making pasta. He looked at Clara, who was sitting in her high chair looking back at him with complete composure, as though she had simply named something that had always been named, and he was slow to catch up. He did not say anything for a moment. Sophia was watching him from across the kitchen. She had been waiting for this. She had watched it approaching for months, in the way that Clara had tracked him and reached for him and arranged herself in proximity to him with the steady certainty of a child who knows where she belongs. She watched the expression on his face now, the expression of a man for whom 11 years of armoring had finally, at the hands of a child in a high chair, come fully undone. He sat down beside Clara's high chair. Clara said again, informatively, in case he had not heard. "Yes," Damiano said. His voice was not entirely steady. "Yes, that's right." He looked at Sophia. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. more precisely and more completely than any words either of them could have managed. Then Clara said, "Pasta," because she had noticed what had been abandoned on the stove, and the moment broke into the ordinary sounds of a kitchen and a family and an evening. The exit completed 14 months. After the arrangement with Carlo Messer, not cleanly. There were complications in the final quarter that required 3 additional months and one very difficult conversation with the 2 men in Diano's inner circle who had been with him since the beginning and did not know until the end was coming. He owed those men a debt that was not payable in money, and he knew it, and he did what he could with its severance, documentation, clean histories, legal employment in the parallel economy he'd spent 4 years building. Some of them accepted it. One did not. Damiano lived with the one who did not, in the ledger he kept for himself, in the accounting that no external authority would ever fully see. When it was done, when Carlo's office made its arrangements and the final legal filings went through and the Voss syndicate ceased to exist as an operating entity, Damiano sat in the restaurant in Chiaia on a Tuesday afternoon when it was closed. With a glass of wine he did not drink, looking at the bay. He sat for an hour. He was not performing anything. He was not marking the occasion for anyone. He was simply sitting with the full weight of what had been, and what had been done with it, and what came next. He thought about his father. His father had built this thing and handed it to a 22-year-old and died before he could see what the 22-year-old would do with it. He thought about what his father would have thought of what he had done, and he found that this question, which had occupied a significant portion of his interior life for 11 years, had finally lost some of its weight. He could not know what his father would have thought. He would never know. And he had, at some point in the past 2 years, in a hospital cafeteria, in a kitchen in the Quartiere Spagnoli, on a church step in the rain, begun to build his life around a different question. Not what would my father think? What will my daughter think? He thought about Clara. He thought about her in 20 years, learning the shape of who her father had been, and what he had done, and what he had chosen when the choice presented itself. He thought about what he wanted that story to contain. He thought about the kind of man he was building, from the inside out, in the way you build things that are meant to last. He finished the wine. He got up. He locked the restaurant behind him. He drove to the Quartiere Spagnoli. Cara Sofia defended her clinical thesis on a Thursday morning in March. Damiano sat in the 3rd row of the examination hall with Clara on his lap. Clara, who was 2.5 now, and had very strong opinions about being held still, which he was managing with the focused negotiation skills of a man who had learned that 2.5-year-olds are among the most formidable negotiators he had ever encountered. He watched Sofia stand at the front of the room in her formal presentation clothes, with her dark hair pulled back and her medical school's crest visible on the materials she had prepared, and he watched her speak. She was presenting on the diagnostic gap in emergency care for patients presenting with atypical symptoms. The gap between what the patient reported and what the standard protocol was designed to detect. Spoke with clarity and intelligence and the specific passion of someone working in the precise intersection of what they are good at and what they care about. The examining committee asked difficult questions. She answered them, not without difficulty. There were 2 moments where he could see her working through something in real time, the calculation happening visibly, the pause before the precise answer. But she answered them, and when she was done the committee exchanged looks of the kind that convey something before the formal announcement does. She passed. She walked out of the examination hall to where he was waiting in the corridor, Clara on his arm, and a look on his face that he was not trying to manage. And Sophia came through the door and stopped when she saw him, and her face did the thing it always did when she stopped managing it. Went wide and lit and entirely herself. He held out his arm. She walked into it. Clara between them grabbed a fistful of each of their coats, which was her preferred configuration, one hand in each, anchoring herself to both simultaneously. "Dr. Marini," Damiano said against her hair. "Not quite yet," she said. "2 more months of rotations." "Dr. Marini," he said again. She laughed. The real laugh, the one that belonged to the wide smile. The one she hadn't been using until she decided she trusted him enough to be that unguarded. He had counted it privately, the number of times he heard that laugh. Each one felt like something given freely. "Let's go home," she said. "Home," he agreed. They walked out of the university into the March light, the 3 of them, through the courtyard where students were moving between lectures, and the old fountain was doing what old fountains do, and the city was doing what Naples always does, being itself noisily, beautifully, with the chaotic abundance of a place that has been reinventing itself for 2,000 years and sees no reason to stop. They were married in June, in the church on Via Tribunali. The same church, the steps where he had crouched down to her level, the stone saints watching the street with patient exhaustion. The city outside, doing what it always did. It was not a large wedding. Carmela was there, crying before the ceremony began and denying it through all subsequent evidence. Enzo was there, standing awkwardly in a suit that fit him well, and an expression that communicated both deep feeling and deep discomfort with deep feeling, which was the most honest thing about him. Marco was there, in a wheelchair, because walking distance was still in negotiation, but present, with a small card on which he had written a single sentence in the new handwriting he was building, 1 letter at a time. DeFazio was there, slightly baffled to find himself at a wedding that had grown from a midnight phone call about housing law, but not, he said later, displeased. Sophia's colleagues from the hospital were there. 2 women she had been close to since her first year, who had kept the connection alive through her leave, and who stood with her now with the particular warmth of women who have watched each other carry things. And Clara, 2.5 years old, dressed in something white that she had already partially escaped from by the time the ceremony began, standing between Damiano and the officiant with the composure of a person who is unclear on the protocol, but determined to participate fully. When the ceremony reached the part where they exchanged vows, Sophia had written hers. He knew she would. She was not someone who borrowed words for the important things. She said, "I asked you for 30 minutes of your attention. You gave me more than that. You gave me the full weight of your mind and your will and your capacity for change, and you gave it honestly, without pretending to be something you weren't or something you aren't yet. I don't need you to be finished. I don't need you to be perfect. I need you to keep doing what you have been doing, which is looking at the problem clearly and working on it seriously and bringing me in on the calculation. That is all I have ever asked of you. That is all I will ever ask." As she paused and looked at him, and her eyes were the eyes he had first seen in the dark at the base of the church steps. The fire, management eyes, the assessment eyes, but open now in a way they hadn't been on that night, open all the way. "And you," she said, "have always given it." Damiano had not written his vows. He had tried and the words had not come, which was unusual for him, and which he had understood, finally, as a sign that what he needed to say was not something that benefited from preparation. He looked at her. "You refused my money," he said, "on a night when you could have used it. You asked for something harder instead. I didn't understand at the time how much harder it was. To actually give someone your attention, to actually think about their problem, to actually be present in the specific way you were asking me to be present. I had forgotten how to do that. I had deliberately unlearned it. He paused. You re-taught me, not by being patient, not by being gentle, though you are both of those things when they are warranted, but by refusing to accept a version of me that was less than what I was capable of being, by standing at the exact distance that was honest and waiting to see if I would close it. He looked at Clara, standing beside them with her white dress escaping its constraints, looking up at him with her mother's dark eyes. And you gave me a daughter? He said to Sophia, who grabbed my finger and held on. Clara, as if on cue, reached up and grabbed two of his fingers in her fist. The congregation laughed. Damiano did not. He was looking at his daughter and then at his wife, and his face had the expression that he had spent 11 years preventing. Entirely open, entirely readable, everything inside visible. I will give you my attention, he said to Sophia. The full weight of it, for the rest of my life. And if you tell me there is a problem, I will sit down on whatever steps are in front of us, and I will think about it with you, and we will solve it. Sophia was crying now. She made no attempt to manage it. We will solve it, she said. Oh. Tashu years later. 5 of them. Damiano Voss was known in Naples as the man who ran the Chiaia restaurant, who was married to the doctor at the emergency clinic on Via Toledo, who had a daughter in primary school with opinions about everything, and then a second child, a son, who had Damiano's eyes and Sophia's stubbornness, and who had arrived into the world in the early morning of a November Thursday and had been named Marco. Marco Ferrante came to the naming ceremony. He walked in slowly with a cane, but he walked in. And when Damiano put the baby in his arms, he looked down at the child with an expression that went all the way through him. Good name? Marco said in the full sentence that he had been building back one word at a time for years. The best name, Damiano said. He was not a reformed man, in the way that stories sometimes tell it. Not a man who had shed his past like a skin and emerged clean. Unmarked new. He carried what he carried. There were nights when the accounting of what had been weighed on him, when the ledger opened without invitation and presented its calculations. He carried those nights honestly, without pretending they weren't there, because pretending was what he had used to do, and he had decided, on a church step in the rain, to stop. But he was also a man who sat in a kitchen at 11 at night while his daughter slept and his wife read. A man who drove his daughter to school and stood at the door of the classroom and felt, watching her march in with her backpack and her opinions, the specific overwhelming gratitude of someone who has been given something they did not earn and have spent every subsequent day trying to deserve. He was a man who had learned what it meant to be asked for your attention instead of your money. He had learned, slowly and completely, that it was the harder ask and the truer one. That a person who asks for your money is accepting the transaction. That a person who asks for your attention is asking for you, specifically the actual substance of you. Your mind, your will, your presence. Your willingness to sit down on whatever steps present themselves and think honestly about whatever problem is in the box. He was that person now. He had been given that by a woman on a church step, in a city he had stopped seeing clearly, on a night when his coat was wet and his mind was running on the map of assets. She had looked up at him with the fire, management eyes and said, "I don't want your money." And he had crouched down, which was not something he did, and asked, "Tell me the problem." And the problem, it turned out, was not the door code. The problem had been him, the sealed version of him, the managed armored, relentlessly forward, facing version of him who had spent 11 years building something that had slowly become a prison. And the solution, as Sophia had understood before he did, had been attention. His, genuinely given, without transaction, without performance, without the careful management of exposure that had become, for him, indistinguishable from living. He thought about this sometimes, in the early mornings when the apartment was still dark and the children were still sleeping and Sophia was next to him with her hand somewhere over his chest, breathing steadily, present even in sleep with that quality of presence that had been, from the very beginning, the thing that cracked him open. He thought, I sat down on those steps because she wouldn't take the money. And he thought, that is the most important thing that has ever happened to me. And in the kitchen of the apartment on the Quartiere Spagnoli, as the Naples morning began to come through the windows and the city outside started its perpetual, chaotic, beautiful reinvention of itself, as Clara's voice came from the next room announcing that she was awake and had opinions about breakfast, as little Marco added his voice to hers in the wordless but emphatic way of the very small, as Sophia opened her eyes and looked at him with the particular look she had, the look that went all the way through him, the one she had stopped managing years ago, the one that said, "Does I see you?" the whole thing, and I stayed. Damiano Voss understood, with the full weight of his attention, which was the thing she had always asked for, and the thing he was now most proud of giving. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, on whatever steps presented themselves, thinking about the problem, with her, to the end.